It's time for Global Insight. Now, South Korea faces a demographic crisis. According to government data released Tuesday, the population declined for the second straight year in 2021, with the birth rate falling for the sixth consecutive year to 0.81 child per woman, the lowest in the world. The downward trend has been continuing for quite a while, raising concerns about the soundness of the country's economic productivity going forward, and as well as leading to more discussions about immigration, a topic that's sensitive in most societies. Korea's Ministry of Justice has been looking to make policy changes to attract skilled migrant workers, as have other countries, including the United Kingdom and New Zealand, particularly after the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic years. And we discussed this ongoing shift in border policies and how they can be reshaped amid significant social changes. We're joined by Song Se-ryun, Professor of Kyunghee University's Law School, and Won Hyuk-cho, Senior Lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington. Thank you for joining us this morning. And my first question to you, Professor Song, joining us in Seoul. Here in South Korea, immigrants in the past, they were managed by different government bodies, but now the Ministry of Justice is saying it wants to take a unified approach and actually encourage immigration to the country. And of course, the issue has been long discussed given Korea's demographic problem, but it's not been a priority issue for politicians or the government. So what's really made it a hot topic now?
Well, as you said, it's a crisis indeed. Korea is an aging society with a very low fertility rate. Population replacement rate is generally about 2.1. Korea is 0.9. Even considering the COVID situation, which is the lowest not only in the developed countries, but in the world. So we talk about demographic cliff. That means a major drop in working population, causing problems in production, pension system, and so on and so forth. Thus far, the focus has been on the short-term workers in a stopgap fashion, but because of the kind of a national sentiment about the Korea being, it is a myth, but a pure-blooded nation with a very coherent tradition. That discussion has been a little bit evaded even, and not very focused. So new administration's focus on this issue is a timely one and needed one economically, but socially as well.
Right, and Professor Cho, well, it doesn't only seem to be a South Korean issue, but other countries as well, such as New Zealand and even post-Brexit UK, they're looking to adjust their immigration policies to attract more workers after the pandemic. So what are the common factors really driving this trend?
This is a complex issue, but the common factor would definitely be labor shortages, which are not new, but the pandemic has made it worse, especially in places like New Zealand, the US, Germany, and of course, South Korea. The post-Brexit UK has faced high job vacancy rates across sectors that rely heavily on immigrant workers. During the pandemic, public health measures and the economic downturn displaced many workers from their job. Now the businesses try to recruit new employees or hire past employees to take up these roles. But it's not that simple because the pandemic has also disrupted the supply of available workers. A large number of immigrants choose to return to their country of origin, so out-migration reduces the number of workers available, and public health measures have decreased migration intake from other countries too. As a result, for example, Australia is down more than 500 million skilled foreign workers compared to the pre-pandemic labor force, and 350,000 fewer in Germany. The pandemic also sparked a wave of early retirement. Those previously employed individuals may not currently be actively looking for jobs for reasons such as lingering health concerns and generous unemployment insurance benefits. And I think the problem of labor shortage will stick around for a while. Numerous reports suggest that labor force shortages are a major barrier to economic recovery and a major contributor to inflation. So immigration policies have been revisited with the idea that more foreign workers would help address those labor shortages issues, especially for many critical sectors relying heavily on immigrant workers, such as hospitality, healthcare, IT, agriculture, and food production. New Zealand is obviously trying to adjust immigration policies, but we still see the lowest arrivals of immigrants since the 1990s, and more people left the country than arrived in the last 16 months. So some experts say the government response is too little and too late.
Well, certainly some of the trends that you mentioned, we're seeing some of the same things in South Korea with the chronic labour mismatch that we have in the markets here. And Professor Song, to overcome our demographic challenges with regard to economic growth, which sectors are really in critical need of extra talents?
Well, if you look at the foreign workers working in the sectors, the labor shortage is pronounced in farming sector, manufacturing, and construction. And it is a commonplace these days to go to the restaurants and hotels and encounter many foreign workers. However, demographic cliff means the labor shortage is more widespread and will be deepening in the future. And also, the young people's vitality and entrepreneurship is something that we need as a society, but because of the demographic cliff, it's going to be a problem going forward. If you look at the countries built and advanced by immigrants, we see that, for example, in the U.S., immigrants with the skills and will to success have been the vital engine for the society and industry. I think the same will be true for Korea going forward.
Professor Song, well, what kind of immigration model should South Korea really look to adopt in order to attract and retain highly skilled workers?
Well, the societies that have looked into this issue before will obviously be a model. U.S., U.K., and Japan are going through the same kind of concerns and problems. However, as I mentioned before, the Korea has this myth and kind of emotional blockage about the Korean people being pure-blooded and with coherent and tradition that everybody shares. So the diversity and the inclusive society is something that we have to kind of get used to. And unfortunately, we had episodes and cases of discrimination of foreign workers in the past. So we definitely have a challenge as a society, and we have to overcome that emotional barrier and try to become a society that fits the 21st century and the needs that we face.
Right, there's a strong need for more of a cultural integration rather than expecting assimilation. And Professor Cho, in most societies, well, the fear is that immigration could drive down wages or displace local workers. Has this been the case for New Zealand? I mean, how does New Zealand really attract migrant workers and what kind of skills do they bring?
The pandemic has reopened the debate about whether the cost of and benefits of immigration are genuine or just a myth. Professor Song did mention about national sentiment in Korea or emotional barrier. But we question whether this anti-immigration sentiment is largely driven by discomfort with demographic changes or loss of national identity or loss of culture. Regarding the cost of immigration, people argue that in New Zealand we should slow down immigration because immigration could displace local Kiwi workers. It could drive wages down or generate housing bubbles. Actually, the current Labour government of New Zealand initially tried to slash net immigration numbers before the pandemic with a very strict labour market test for immigrant workers, although there was a strong pushback from businesses and industries who said they could not find enough local Kiwi workers to fill certain jobs. The Labour government argued New Zealand needed a little breathing room on immigration to allow the country to catch up on infrastructure and housing and stop wages from being too low, and ensure that domestic employers properly seek to hire local Kiwi workers before recruiting from overseas. Regarding the benefits, studies have shown that immigration significantly increases income per capita and government budget resources. In terms of economic contributions, immigration has played a big role in New Zealand's economic growth over the past decade. Immigration also needed in order to buffer the dramatic changes in the age structure of our population. Professor Song mentioned about the record low birth rate in South Korea. Indeed, migration has helped New Zealand and Australia and placed them in a much better position to support the aged population than any other OECD countries.
And Professor Cho, well, what's important is really helping these immigrants integrate into New Zealand or South Korean society and social programs for them. Here in Korea, they usually focus on multicultural families or a very specific group of ethnic Koreans from other countries. So how should the Korean government then pursue successful settlement and integration of diverse nationalities into Korean society? This question goes to both of you, but let's start with you, Professor Cho.
This is really a great question as it shifts the focus from the instrumental value of immigrants to the issues of their well-being and cultural diversity. Professor Song also mentioned about diversity and inclusion. I think those are quite important dimensions in overall immigration policy. It seems that South Korea is not doing enough to take care of the well-being of immigrants and their families. I saw the recent announcement by the Korea's Justice Ministry that they would create separate immigration agencies to centrally coordinate immigration to attract immigrants with fast-track path to citizenship while giving more residency visas for highly skilled workers. But Korea's approach seems very instrumental. On the other hand, one of my colleagues, Professor Arthur Grimes, recently suggested a well-being approach to immigration policy. He argued that well-being considerations are almost entirely absent in many immigration policy interventions, and they are rather exclusively driven by how immigrants can contribute to our country's economy and productivity. For example, many governments try to improve the visa approval process for highly productive and highly paid workers to better align with good labor market outcome. In other words, these immigration policies essentially treat some of the immigrants as a second class. So I would like to suggest a more well-being focused and diversity focused approach to immigration policies to balance the existing instrumental perspective, which is also necessary. And South Korea may want to build its reputation for prioritizing well-being and diversity.
And same question to you, Professor Song. How should South Korea really adjust its immigration policy to make it perhaps broader but also more targeted at the same time?
Yeah, for that reason, I think that the government's policy is very important. So far, government's policy have focused on the border control and the short-term visa issues to plug the hole in the labor sector. I think that the Immigration Bureau, if we focus on the immigration, which means that people come here and live with us as a part of the society, I think that the signals of the policy change. In a Korean society, especially in the farming sector, it has had a little bit of appreciable history of having wives coming over and multicultural families living together in the society. I think so. We have some cases that we can look into and see what works and what does not work in Korea, and how the national consensus as to how we can expand our inclusiveness and that translates into social policies and national policies, so that we can not only address the labor issue, but kind of look into what kind of Korea is necessary and appropriate for the 21st century and also long term in the future.
Professor Song, well, would it be worth making perhaps visa statuses more flexible in terms of what kind of work you can get? Because there are many foreigners here in South Korea who come to Korea with a certain visa, but then they want to change their status or change their jobs. But then the way the system works right now is that the employers really sponsor their visa. So if they want to change their jobs, that might be a bit difficult. So would it be possible then, or should it be worth considering making visa statuses more flexible?
I think that has been one of the problems because of the restrictive and also very rigid requirements for the visas. When they come, their skills might be one set of skills, but they develop into different workers, and we have to be accommodating to that. I think the idea is having good talent and not only restricted on one sector to treat them as a very single-minded laborers, but somebody who will benefit the society in general in Korea through the immigration policy. That requires, as you said, more flexible policies and looking at not only looking at the immigrants or ingress workers as a labor workers, but somebody with a human rights and somebody with the freedom that Korea can afford to them, and let them develop as workers and a part of the society.
And your thoughts on this, Professor Cho? How do you think about what do you think about this whole visa flexibility issue? I know we were speaking about this a couple of days ago, where some workers, they arrive in the country with one type of visa, but they end up even running away from their place of employment. And how do you think the country should really perhaps alter its visa sponsorship system?
Regarding the visa sponsorship and seasonal worker sponsorship schemes and so on, now I think we are in a crisis in South Korea because migrant arrivals are at their lowest level since the 1990s in South Korea as well. And the number of foreign nationals dropped significantly from 2.5 million to just above 2 million. Regarding the shortages of labor in South Korean farms, for example, the past years have seen more and more foreign workers changing employers or even professions in search for better paid, more stable or safer working conditions. And one result of this crisis is renewed attention to immigration policy and seasonal worker sponsorship scheme as a tool to meet some of these demands. But government should really ensure that immigration policies or visa schemes are not misused to simply secure cheap labor. Improving enforcement of labor laws is essential both for tracking exploitation of foreign workers and preventing downward pressure on wages, and also working conditions for those workers. So government should, maybe the Ministry of Justice, should consider additional safeguards such as some delinking work permits from a single employer and other measures too.
Well, I'm afraid this is where we'll have to leave the discussion today. That was Hong Tae-ryun, Professor of Law at Kyung University, and Professor Cho Won-hyuk, a Senior Lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington. Thank you both so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having me.